This is a special treat for me. We were colleagues on the across the street, and one of my period as first deputy managing director here was I think the duty I looked forward to the most was a monthly lunch with Ngozi to try to straighten out our two institutions.
You should tell them the joke of how we were going to a meeting on the Hill. And you remember that? I was standing waiting for a taxi to take me, and John comes up in his car, and he says, "Why are you standing on the road? Where is your car?" And I said, at the World Bank, we don't, managing director doesn't have any. So he gave me a lift.
Thank you for reminding us. Appreciate that. Well, onward and upward, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to this spring meeting of the Bretton Woods Committee. And I think oftentimes when you think about the WTO, it's easy to forget that its predecessor, the GATT, was one of the three principal institutions of the post-war order. The United Nations for security and politics and political issues, the IMF and the World Bank, especially the IMF for financial issues, and the GATT, now the WTO, for trade, because when you go back, and I'm sure many of you have, read the base documents of the IMF, its purpose was to create a financial system that would promote trade as a driver of global growth. And so the WTO is an integral part and a key part from the very start of the post-war order that parenthetically produced 60, 70, 80 years of the fastest economic growth ever known, and the fastest reduction in poverty, or the greatest reduction in poverty ever known. Now, we all remember back, or now maybe those of us of my age remember of the creation of the WTO and its controversy. But you also remember that it was the global financial crisis that created the G20 at the leaders level. And at the first G20 summit in November 2008, one of the four principal planks, if you will, of the G20 leaders communique was, number one, a pledge to avoid new protectionist measures and to promote the adoption of the Doha development round. Did either of those happen? They did not. And not only did they not, but there's been a proliferation of protectionist measures, and the WTO's dispute resolution mechanism has fallen into disuse because it's, I don't know what words you would use, Secretary General, but...
I'm going to challenge that.
Oh, good. So there were many of us who thought that the re-empowerment of the WTO was absolutely critical to sustaining progress in the global economy in the way that we hoped and wanted. And therefore, there were many of us who were overjoyed when you were named Secretary General, feeling that this was a ray of hope and an indication that the members were serious about making this institution work better. Well, we just finished a ministerial. Why don't you start by telling us where you think things stand and what can we look forward to in terms of, first, strengthening the WTO and the progress for the world trading system?
Well, thank you. You've opened up a whole array of issues. But let me just start by saying I'm sure it's very difficult for people in today's fractured world to imagine that this system that was created 80 years ago and started with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that was the precursor to the WTO, And then 50 years later, it was made the WTO, which is now 30 years old. But I really look at the whole system as 80 years, that it has endured. And it has provided a stable, free, predictable, fairly open system of multilateral trade for the world. It's pretty amazing. And I just want you to think about it, that the system created underpins 75% of world trade today. People may think, oh, there are so many bilateral and regional agreements. Yes, but they are all based on the platform of the WTO and only control about 20–25% of world trade. The bulk of world trade today, 75%, is under WTO terms. So people just take that for granted. So that's the first thing I want to say.
Good.
I think the second thing I'd like to emphasize is how much the system has really changed and transformed and enabled the world to become more prosperous. In the past 6 decades, the volume of trade has increased 20 times. From 1995 to now, you know, real per capita incomes of rich countries has increased by 50%. And for emerging markets and developing economies, 150%, albeit from a low base. It has also helped to change the balance of power. And I really want to say that. Trade-enabled growth means that today the G7 countries produce 30% of world output, the BRICS 32%, and with the new additions, it will be 37%. So it has really contributed to making the world more prosperous, and people should not forget that. Now, that's why it's amazing that those who created this system that has given so much are beginning to have doubts about whether it should really continue in the same way, and that brings about some of the issues you raised about protectionism, and we've seen a rise in trade restrictions over the past 15 years in a cumulative way, at least from our own database, about 2,500 restrictions. And I know the fund has more because they use a different database. We've seen prohibitions, and we've seen the use of subsidies and others. So yes, protectionist measures are coming in, and we have to be careful, because the spillover effects of these measures can lead to fragmentation of trade. And fragmenting trade, world trade, does not work for anyone. We did some simulations at the WTO and some work that shows that if we fragment into 2 trading blocks because of these kinds of measures, we will have a 5% loss in real global GDP in the longer term. The fund has done the same and is showing 7%, double-digit losses for emerging markets and developing countries. So yes, this is not a direction we should go in. And for the WTO, we are pressing very much, putting this case forward so that people don't forget what they created and the good that is delivering. And because we've just seen vulnerability of supply chains fall into the thinking that maybe a world that is fragmented will deliver better than one that is working together on the multilateral trading system. So I just want to make those points to remind people not to forget the good we have. Now, coming back to the WTO, 19 months ago, we had the 12th ministerial. And of course, one of the things we saw was that because of our consensus-based system, and I don't know how many people know that decisions at the WTO are made completely on consensus, meaning every member must agree. So it's not like the consensus of the World Bank or the IMF. Yeah, every member must agree. And that makes decision-making really difficult, isn't it? At first, when I came, I was quite frustrated because it leads to you not delivering results. But then I thought about it. How many places or institutions in this world can the smallest country with 100,000 or 200,000 people have the same voice as the USA? How many? Or Europe? None. So when you think about it that way, that this is a place where The smallest has the same voice as the largest. You hold your frustration in check. So it makes things difficult, but it's also quite exciting to see. But the reason the WTO was not getting the results it should was partly because of this. And in the 12th ministerial, we were able to break through that after COVID, and we were able to deliver 6 multilateral agreements plus a whole slew of decisions and declarations. Come the 13th ministerial, 13 is my lucky number, but I was born on the 13th. But we didn't do as much, but we did do some good things. And I actually tell people I feel a bit resentful because the things we accomplished were very meaningful things for developing countries. But they were not the types of things that the developed countries cared too much about. So they were not written about in the press. At the 13th ministerial, the 28 poorest countries in the world were able to get an agreement from everyone that they should be given a transition period when they leave the least developed country status to still benefit from all the flexibilities that poorest countries are entitled to at the WTO for another 3 years, a transition. And they've been trying to get this for the past decade. They got it. We also got another agreement that developing countries have been seeking for the past couple of decades to try and review the ways, what we call special and differential treatment. That is the special flexibilities that developing countries are entitled to at the WTO, how it can be made more effective for developing countries. Again, it's been taking almost 2 decades to get an agreement. We got a breakthrough. You know, so I'm not saying that 2 decades is the pace that someone like Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala wants to go at. But still, the fact we broke through and we got an agreement to look at this for the sanitary and phytosanitary measures agreement, technical barriers to trade, 2 agreements. It's a breakthrough. And developing countries were really excited about this. But did you hear about it anywhere? No. So we got that. We also got an extension to the moratorium on not charging customs duties on digitally delivered services trade, which was really good. Yeah. Now, I was disappointed, personally, that we did not close on the harmful fisheries subsidies agreement. We did phase 1 at MC12. This is an agreement that takes care of our oceans, sustainability of our oceans, wants to stop overfishing and overcapacity. And I really get excited when the WTO is dealing with things of the global commons, because that's what I think we should be focusing on. So we didn't close that. We also didn't get a breakthrough on the long-standing agricultural trade agreement. So those were 2 things that I was disappointed with. But the things we got for developing countries, I feel pretty good about.
Congratulations.
Yeah, now.
Yes.
The dispute settlement system.
Thank you. You read my mind.
You said that it's not, what did you call it?
I was hoping you would supply the description.
No, so the description you gave, John, is not correct.
Okay.
It is true that our dispute settlement system, which is practically the only place in the world where one country can bring another for trade disputes, so that's why it's so well known, that the second tier, it's 2 tiers. There's the panel level and the appeals level. The appeals level, yes, has not been working because the election of judges was blocked under the last administration. But several US administrations had problems with the appellate body. That's what it's called. And so it's come to define the WTO. So everybody says the appellate body, the dispute settlement system is paralyzed, the WTO is not working. That's absolutely not true. I've just described to you the number of things, and I've not even gone 1/4 of the way that are happening, the agreements that are being reached on the organization. But for the dispute settlement system itself, it's working at the panel level. And right as I speak, there are 11 disputes, new disputes have been brought in the past 18 months. 12 have been settled. And I just want to talk a little bit about the 12 that were settled, because it's interesting. Our dispute settlement system has provisions for mediation, for arbitration, for dialogue, for good offices. All these are supposed to be tried before you go to this quote-unquote, caught part of the system. But I think the frustration that the US and maybe others had is that everything became litigation. So members were no longer using these other avenues, which are provided for. What I have to tell you is that now they are. 12 disputes have been settled in very creative ways. You've heard of the China-Australia disputes?
Yes.
Barley, wine. Well, they were brought to the dispute settlement system. But guess what? They are being settled outside of that system through other interesting means, which I will not go into here because there's no time. US, India, they settled some disputes, and I can go on and on. So actually, the appellate body not working has allowed some creativity and the use of other means to settle disputes. So that's what I want to tell you. So the system is not paralyzed. Now, it is also true that some cases have been appealed into the void because the appellate body doesn't work, 31 cases. So we do want to reform it. Developing countries also want it reformed because they find it not so accessible. So grosso modo, it's not paralyzed, it's working, but we can make it better, and we embarked on that reform.
Mm-hmm. Now, didn't the G20 leaders commit to restoring the appellate level of the dispute mechanism by the end of this year? Is this a G20 leaders kind of promise, or is it really going to happen?
Yeah, no, it's oh, I don't know what that says about G20 leaders. It's actually a promise of the 164 members, the ministers of trade, who came together and made that promise at the 12th ministerial. And that was the first breakthrough we got on the reform. And we have moved some way. The US has been constructive. We started the reform, and we are still pledged to try and complete it at the end of this year. So it's moving. It's not easy. There are some tricky issues, like the national security exception that needs to be discussed. How are we going to handle that? Use of subsidies, how is that going to be handled? So there are a few tricky issues that are coming up that will take a bit of negotiating.
Well, good luck. Now.
Thank you.
I know an area you've been concerned about is trade finance and access to trade finance. Tell us a little bit about your concerns and about what the WTO is doing to improve access to trade finance.
Well, actually, you know, the Asian Development Bank has estimated a $2.5 trillion trade finance gap in the world. And we found that trade finance issues are not issues of developed countries. 60 to 80% of trade in the rich countries is covered by trade. So they don't really have a problem. That's also why you don't hear so much about it.
Exactly.
But in the developing countries, we found that this is a problem. And of course, if you want to trade and integrate into the world trading system, but you don't have access to finance, what does that mean? That impedes your ability to do better. So this is why we're interested in making sure that we find ways to cover that gap. And we've done a number of studies with the IFC, both in the West Africa region, and also in the Mekong, where we found that you know, the coverage is about 25%. And our work shows that if we increase that up to 40%, we could actually get an 8% growth in trade per year, which is substantial. So the numbers all show we should do more. So we are not a finance agency, but we know all about trade and how it should be used. So we're partnering with the IFC to move more finance. We've started a forum of all the multilateral and trade finance banks. We had the first meeting in Marrakesh, and we're hoping to continue so that we can use that forum to leverage more trade finance for developing countries. And you know, since the financial crisis, we've had problems with correspondent banking. Some of the rules that came in, the spillover effect on correspondent banking in developing countries was not a good one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
I don't think people may not be aware. Among other things, anti-money laundering concerns basically encourage a lot of the big banks who are engaged, private banks engaged in trade finance, to say it's not worth it to me to get messed up in this.
Yeah. So that
are we making progress?
Yeah, we are making progress, and we are very pleased with the partnerships that we have. The IFC is doing a great job on this, and others are pitching in.
And you're getting private banks engaged?
We are. We are getting. The first meeting was more with public banks. Mm-hmm. But private banks are also interested in yes. joining us. Yeah. So we increase the circle, because some of them, like my former Standard Chartered Bank where I was on the board, are doing an amazing job.
Now, you've mentioned earlier the global commons. And of course, one of the immediate concerns is climate. Tell us about your vision on how the interaction between climate and trade and the WTO's potential contribution in this area.
Well, most people, when they think about trade, they think it's part of the problem for climate, because they think about the emissions that come from shipping and aviation and transport. And they're right, but I'm actually quite excited at some of the solutions that I see coming up. The transportation industry, they're all looking at alternative solutions, green hydrogen in shipping, et cetera, renewable forms of fuel. But they never think of trade as part of the solution. And we believe that you cannot solve net zero by 2050. You cannot decarbonize without trade. First, you need trade to spread the new technologies at scale. And without trade, you cannot do it. So that's the first thing that is obvious. When you have loss and damage, you need trade to recover. So people should really think of that. But beyond that, one of the things we are seeing is that the varying approaches to dealing with decarbonization, be it carbon pricing, different approaches, 78 fragmented approaches to carbon pricing and carbon markets in the world. And they are not all sort of interoperable, if you will. And so this is leading to issues of trade frictions, where some countries feel that perhaps the measures being applied by another country are more for protectionist purposes, and not really, that they're hiding behind, decarbonizing, lowering greenhouse gas emissions. They're hiding behind that to really take protectionist measures. So we're seeing some emergence of trade frictions on that. And so this is where the WTO is also looking at how can we be part of the solution. And we believe that trying to come up with a framework, a common global framework for carbon pricing, would be helpful to business. Can you imagine when you go from one market to the other, how you have to deal with different systems and different approaches to decarbonization? So we are working on such a framework. Last year in Marrakesh, when we found out that the WTO is working on an approach, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, you remember I suggested to the finance ministers that we have a task force. Let all the multilateral or international institutions come together to try and develop a common approach instead of each of us working differently. And that's what we're doing now. We have a task force with the IMF, the World Bank, led by coordinated by the WTO. OECD is a member, UNCTAD is a member, and UNFCCC has just joined. So we are now working on a common approach. And if we can do that, we'll have some interoperability between systems that will enable business to maneuver better on this, and will help us because it will lower trade frictions. So that's one contribution. We have also put across a toolkit. I forgot, I wish I had a copy to show you. We put at COP28 a toolkit of 10 ways that members of the WTO countries can use trade policy to help them get to net zero by 2050. Some of these policies are very doable. Look at your tariff regime and see what tariffs you have on renewables versus fossil fuel. Look at what you're charging for combustion engine vehicles versus electric vehicles. And you see many countries that actually their tariffs are higher for electric vehicles than for fossil fuel vehicles. And that is not right. If you want to encourage renewables, you have to review that. So this is one of the trade policies we think you can look at. Public procurement. The WTO is the holder of we have a government procurement agreement. And government procurement is $13 trillion. And this procurement is responsible for about 15% of emissions. So we're saying with such purchasing power, why can't we use procurement to drive green? So these are some of the things. I could go on and on, but perfectly doable things by governments that we put together. So grosso modo, trade is part of the solution. We've made some very concrete and practical suggestions for how trade can help you lower your greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. If you've gotten the message here, in case you thought the WTO wasn't getting much done these days, you just weren't paying attention. And if you knew the Secretary General before, you expected this result. Is there any other initiative or any theme that you'd like to mention that I have not had the foresight to ask about?
I think you've mentioned a lot, but I just want people to know that there are several exciting things happening in trade. So beyond our legacy agreements, digital trade. Digital trade is where the action is. Digitally delivered services trade is growing at 9% per year. It is a $4 trillion business now, and it is the fastest growing portion of trade. So we're very excited, but there are no rules governing it. So right now at the WTO, we have an e-commerce agreement being negotiated as a plurilateral, which means a segment of our members, 90 of them, are negotiating this to lay down the rules that will govern digital trade. I'm excited about it because we found that small and medium enterprises are the ones you find, who are benefiting most from this, women. And so if you can really enable this, this will be an exciting thing for the future. Green trade is $1.7 trillion. That's another thing happening that we need to look at. Services. I could go on and on. So there are a lot of exciting things happening in trade that this is what the WTO should be looking at for the future. That's where we should be putting our sights, and how to use AI to help lower trading costs. These are some of the new things we are worrying about.
So you won't be bored?
Not at all.
Then please join me first in thanking the Secretary General.